A point of personal privilege. Some years ago, my wife and I were doing some lectures in Tupelo, Mississippi. We went to a cocktail party for all of the liberals in Tupelo. It was a very small party. And I met two incredible people. I met Helen first, and then she introduced me to her, I assumed her husband. His name was Edwin. And she introduced him by saying, "This is my live-in lover." I thought that's the best designation I've ever heard for a husband. And here they sit in our gathering this morning. If you go to Tupelo, you will see the birthplace of Elvis Presley, if you want to see the birthplace of Elvis Presley. Let me say one other word of appreciation. Roger's book is really terrific. You'll find an endorsement by me on the back of it. Sometimes people don't read the back. But this man is really making a witness. And I'd like for you to know that it's not easy to make the kind of witness he's making in the kind of community in which you are living. There's an awful lot of abuse that comes to someone who stands out. In New Zealand, they have something called the tall poppy syndrome. Any poppy that sticks its head above the others gets its head cut off right quickly. Now, I have been in places where Roger is now. I know what it's like. I can remember a time when my mail was averaging about 5,000 letters a week, and 4,999 of them were angry or hostile. It eats at your soul to be able to have to absorb that kind of negativity, usually from Christians. I've had 16 death threats in my life, and never one of them was from an atheist or a Buddhist. They were everyone from Bible-quoting, true-believing Christians who somehow were so deeply threatened that murder was on their minds. Roger lives in a lot of that, and I think it's just important for people to know that so that you can treat him with tenderness and kindness, because he is a Missouri state treasure. And I'm delighted that he's being discovered around the world. He told me that he's going to be doing some lectures in England for an organization called the Progressive Christian Network of the United Kingdom, an organization I've had a lot to do with over the years. And he's going to two churches in Glasgow, where I've also been, and the last time I was there, I was picketed by Christians, of course. In any event, let's get on to today. Last year in June, when my book, The Fourth Gospel, Tales of a Jewish Mystic, first came out, my publisher, HarperCollins, arranged, as they normally do, a media tour. And one stop on that media tour was in New York City at a studio where I was interviewed via satellite for a company called ABC. But that meant the Australian Broadcasting Company. The interviewer was a woman I had known for some time because she has interviewed me on several occasions in Australia. Her name was Geraldine Doogie. Hard to forget that name. But what fascinated me was her opening question. I was staring into a box, and she spoke to me, and her opening question was, "Why do you want to upset people so regularly?" She was not concerned with whether or not the book had value or truth or good research or was exciting. Her only concern was that my conclusions might upset some people. Those people who assumed that traditional Christianity is absolutely true. Now, it's not my intention or purpose to be upsetting. But Geraldine did not understand something very basic about traditional Christian religion. Christianity as a religion did not drop from heaven fully written and fully developed. It came about in stages. And I've put some of the stages of our earliest parts of history on this board. Let me review them quickly. Jesus lived between 4 BCE and 30 of this Common Era. I won't go into detail as to how we've arrived at those, but those are pretty established numbers. So the crucifixion took place on or around the year 30 of this Common Era. Do you know we have not one written word about Jesus for the next 21 years? Not one written word, not one scrap, not one bit of evidence. We call that the oral period. It's awfully hard to preserve oral things. I call it a silent tunnel. If one asked what Christianity looked like, no one could answer. And then that silence was broken in the year 51 by a man named Paul, who wrote his first epistle. It was the one we call 1 Thessalonians. It's dated about 51. And that was the first written record that we have that a person named Jesus of Nazareth ever lived. 21 years after the crucifixion. Paul proceeded to write between 51 and 64 when he died, 13 years. There are 14 epistles in the New Testament that at one point or another in history have been claimed to have been written by Paul. The fact is, he wrote only 7 of them. If you're interested, they are 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, so they were probably at least 4 letters before they got collapsed into 2, Romans, Philemon, and Philippians. That's the Pauline corpus. And they can be dated between 51 and 64. There were 3 other epistles written probably a decade after Paul's death that were later attributed to him. They are 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians. But there's a lot of data in all 3 that reveal that they're written at a much later time. And then there are 3 other epistles that are written at least a generation after Paul's death, and they are 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. And the reason you know they're later than Paul's life is that Paul has become a revered elder statesman. He was a very controversial polemicist in his life. So by the time you've achieved the status of a revered elder statesman, you know that a good chunk of time has passed. I'm still looking forward to becoming a revered elder statesman. And then finally, there's the Epistle to the Hebrews, and I could make a better case for Roger being its author than I could for Paul being its author. So those are the first places that we have any written information that we still possess about Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the trouble is that Paul in his epistles doesn't say much about Jesus. Perhaps that's because he was writing letters. But what he left out or what he never seemed to know about is astonishing. There's not a word about the birth of Jesus in the writings of Paul. Well, he does say he was born of a woman. That doesn't sound too controversial. He does say he was born under the law. Every person is born of a woman. Every Jew is born under the law. That's all Paul says about the birth of Jesus. Paul does not seem to have any idea that miracles were ever associated with the memory of Jesus. There's not a reference to a miracle anywhere. Paul seems to know nothing about Jesus' teaching. He seems to know nothing about the parables. Paul covered the crucifixion of Jesus in one sentence. And in that one sentence, there is not a word about being betrayed by a man named Judas. There's not a word about a man named Pilate and his role. There's not a word about thieves being crucified on each side of him. There's not a word about the crowd taunting him. Paul covers the burial of Jesus in one sentence, quote, "He was buried," unquote. That's all he says. There's no reference to a tomb or a man named Joseph of Arimathea. Paul covers the resurrection equally as slightly. On the third day he was raised. Note it's a past verb, past tense verb. Jesus never rises in Paul. He is always raised in Paul. And then all Paul gives us is a list of witnesses who can witness to the reality of his being raised. He never describes a resurrection appearance. And the list is 6 categories, individuals and categories. He appeared first unto Cephas, and then to the 12. And that's right interesting, because Judas is still among them. Couldn't have a 12 if Judas weren't among them. When you get to Matthew in the mid-80s, Jesus only appears to the 11. The story of Judas has entered the tradition between Paul and Matthew. It's rather fascinating what Paul doesn't say. When he gets to the end of that list, guess who his last witness to the resurrection is? Himself. And last of all, he appeared unto me. Paul is arguing that what he experienced of the risen Christ was identical with what everybody else experienced, except his was last. And Paul's conversion is dated by most scholars as occurring somewhere between 1 and 6 years after the crucifixion. So if Paul claims that he is a witness to the resurrection, then what was the resurrection in Paul's mind? Was it resuscitation back into the life of this world? Well, the only trouble with being resuscitated is that you have to die again. That's the only way you get out of this world. And Jesus apparently tried that, and it didn't work. But why does Paul say when he writes to the Corinthians that death has no more dominion over him? Why does he say he died unto sin but is alive unto God? What kind of resurrection is Paul talking about? There's no story in Paul about what we would call the ascension. There's no story about what we would call Pentecost. And that's all the Christian church had until about 64. The Christian faith did not drop out of the sky fully developed. It came about in stages. About the year 72, now 42 years after the crucifixion, the first gospel was written. It's the one we call Mark. For the first time in Mark, you get a narrative of the crucifixion event itself. But it's fascinating that Mark never quotes an eyewitness. His authority for telling his story is Psalm 22, written about 450 years before, and 2nd Isaiah, written about 540 years before. So he tells the story of Jesus' crucifixion dictated by Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53, so that he creates the narrative to make it conform with those expectations. When I was a child going to Sunday school in Charlotte, I was told that these prophets miraculously predicted the events that Jesus literally fulfilled and lived out. It was the other way around. The story was written to conform to the prophets and the Psalter. Are you aware that in the 8th decade, when Mark is written, in the 8th decade of the Christian era, that is the first time in any part of the Christian tradition that the name Judas Iscariot is mentioned? 8th decade. The first mention of Jesus being associated with miracles is the 8th decade. The first mention of Jesus teaching in parables is the 8th decade. The first time the story of the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness is told is in the 8th decade. The first time the transfiguration of Jesus is told, where he turns whiter than any Clorox on earth could have gotten him and speaks to Moses and Elijah, is in the 8th decade. The first story of an empty tomb on Easter Sunday morning is in the 8th decade. And even in Mark, the first gospel, there is no appearance of the risen Christ to anyone. That's why they kept writing new endings to Mark, because it seemed to miss something so vital. It wasn't until the 9th decade, around the year 85, that Matthew is written. And Matthew is the gospel in which the virgin birth tradition enters the Christian faith for the first time. It was not original. It's a 9th decade addition. It's built on a text from Isaiah 7:14 that Matthew interpreted to read, quote, "Behold, a virgin will conceive." That's not what Isaiah says. Isaiah says, "Behold, a woman is with child." That's a little different. Behold, a virgin will conceive. Behold, a woman is with child. Maybe things are different in Springfield, but where I come from, if a woman is with child, she is not a virgin. How long have we known this? We've known this since the dialogue between Justin Martyr and Trypho the Jew in the early years of the 2nd century, about 125. We've known that Matthew did not quote Isaiah correctly, but we paid no attention to it. Matthew is the one who gives us for the first time the story of Jesus delivering the Sermon on the Mount. It's a 9th decade addition to the Christian story. Matthew is the first gospel writer to give us a narrative of an actual appearance of Jesus as the raised Christ. He gives us 2 of those. Once is an appearance to the women at the tomb at dawn on the first day of the week, which is interesting because Mark said the women did not see the risen Christ at dawn on the first day of the week. And he gives us the first story of Jesus appearing to the disciples. And that's fascinating because it is clearly not a resuscitated body that appears. The disciples trudge up the mountain, but Jesus appears out of the sky, glorified. A visionary experience. And for the first time in Christian history, the raised Christ is quoted as having said anything to anybody. The first statement of the risen Christ in Christian history is a 9th decade piece in Matthew that you and I call the Great Commission. Go into all the world, proclaim the gospel. It was not until the late 9th decade, and maybe even the early 10th decade, that Luke enters the Christian tradition, the 3rd gospel. He too tells a birth story, but as I suggested last night, it's a very different birth story, more contradictory than complementary. Luke is the first gospel writer to give us what most of us think of as the favorite parables of Jesus. They don't appear until the 9th or 10th decade in Luke. That's like the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan, and Lazarus and Dives, Lazarus and the rich man. They appear in the Christian tradition for the first time in Luke, somewhere between 89 and 93. Luke also turns the resurrection into a very physical event. Jesus is resuscitated by the time you get to Luke. He literally walks out of the tomb. And Luke portrays him as breathing and eating and walking and talking and interpreting Scripture. But then Luke has a problem. How do you get rid of him? How do you get Jesus out of this world if he's been physically resuscitated? And so Luke is the one who adds the story of the ascension of Jesus. The physical body of Jesus has to be removed from time and space. So Luke does it by telling the story of the ascension. And if you know anything about the Hebrew Scriptures, you know that he based the story of Jesus' ascension on the story of the ascension of Elijah. If you want to go back and read that, try 2 Kings chapter 2. They're almost identical stories. So those are the things that come into the tradition with Luke. He adds the ascension, and he, for the first time, adds the story of Pentecost and the gift of the Holy Spirit. And then John arrives in the latter years of the 10th decade. John simply omits the birth stories. He surely knew about them, but he omits them. Maybe he felt their inadequacy. We can't be sure. The miracles become signs in John's gospel. And John introduces new characters that have never been heard of before in the entire history of the Christian story. And what he does with Pentecost is interesting. Pentecost happens in John's gospel on the evening of the first Easter day in an upper room. It is not the Holy Spirit being poured out upon all the nations as it was in Luke. It's Jesus breathing on the disciples to receive the Holy Spirit. And John treats the breathing of Jesus on the disciples and giving them the Holy Spirit as the second coming of Jesus. It was not a future event, the end of the world. Jesus breathed on them, and they were filled with the Holy Spirit. Pentecost is radically different when you read it in John's Gospel. Now, what I want to illustrate with this very brief analysis is that the Christian story grows. It was not fully developed at any one point. It is an evolving story. Now, we could go on, but I don't have time. The creeds are the product of the 4th century. They're not original. They're a 4th century attempt to describe Jesus. They are not girdles into which you have to force your flabby faith. They are 4th century attempts to explain Jesus in the light of Greek thinking that is quite dualistic, where God and human life are separate categories, where heaven and earth are separate categories, where bodies and souls are separate categories, where flesh and spirit are separate categories. They are quite dated because they're framed in the 4th century. There is no such thing as an eternal explanation of anything, because the explainer is not eternal. The explainer always stands in time and space, making the assumptions available to the person in that particular moment of history. So if you want to take the creeds literally, you've got to believe that the earth is the center of a 3-tiered universe, because the creeds have an escalator going up and down between the 3 tiers. Made perfect sense in the 4th century. Doesn't make a great deal of sense to post-Galileo space-traveling men and women. Also, when you get into history, the myth of the virgin grows. The virgin is not a primary figure in the New Testament. She becomes a primary figure only in mythology and Western history. Let me trace that for just a moment. Mary is not a virgin in either Paul or Mark. They have never heard of that story. Indeed, Mark tells the story of the mother of Jesus feeling embarrassed about him and thinking he's, quote, out of his mind. The Greek word is beside himself. And she and his brothers go to take him away in chapter 3 of Mark. That's hardly the behavior that a woman would carry out if an angel had appeared to her and told her that this baby was going to be the Son of God, and by the time he's grown, she thinks he's out of his mind. There's no birth story in Mark. God enters Mark at the baptism. In the first chapter of Mark, Jesus is a fully grown adult human being who comes to be baptized, and in his baptism the heavens open and the Spirit descends, and God claims him as his son. That's in Mark. He had never heard of the birth tradition. So she becomes a virgin in Matthew, And she remains a virgin in Luke. But in the early years of the Christian history, just after the turn of the 2nd century, she becomes not just a virgin, but a permanent virgin. That means they've got to get rid of his brothers and sisters, so they become cousins or half-brothers and half-sisters. But they're in the text. Paul talks about the brother James in Galatians. Mark names the names of 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Mark says he's got at least 2 sisters. But they become rather inconvenient when she becomes a permanent virgin. And then the permanent virgin becomes the ideal woman. Now let me ask you a question. To whom is a permanent virgin an ideal woman? Only to a celibate male. Who do you think was making the definition? This is quite subjective. By the 3rd century, she has become a postpartum virgin. Now that's really impressive. That is, she gave birth without the birth destroying the virginal hymen. So stories began to circulate about Jesus being born out of Mary's ear. And they began to, the fathers of the church, and there were no mothers, they were only fathers. The fathers of the church began to search the scriptures to see if they could find a prophetic text that would be predicting that she would be a postpartum virgin. And they found one. It's in the 44th chapter of Ezekiel, written about 700 years before the birth of Jesus. And they leaped upon this text and they pulled it out and said, see, the prophets predicted the postpartum virginity. Do you know what the text said? And I'm really not kidding. The text says, quote, and the gates of the city were closed and only the Lord could come in and out, unquote. And without the slightest bit of embarrassment, they said, the prophets have predicted the postpartum virginity of Jesus. By the 19th century, she had become immaculately conceived. Do you ever wonder why? Well, it took 1900 years to work that out. It's because in the early years of the 18th century, the scientific world discovered that women had an egg cell. They didn't know that before. They didn't understand procreation. They thought the life of the baby always lived in the sperm of the male, and all he did was to plant it in the womb of the female. Like a farmer plants his seed in the soil, and the soil nurtures the seed, but the soil doesn't contribute to the seed. So nobody thought women had much to do with procreation until they discovered that women have an egg cell. But as soon as women have an egg cell, and we know that, then the virgin birth no longer works. Why? Because in the virgin birth, the whole life has to come through the male. The woman is just a receptacle, an incubator. So you never have to get rid of the mother to have a divine birth. You only have to get rid of the father. But when we discover that women have an egg cell, women became co-creators with every life that has ever been. So 50% of the genetic makeup of every person who has ever been born comes from your mother. And guess what? Your mother is a child of Adam. So she passes on original sin. So the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin had to take place so that she wouldn't pass on original sin since she was a child of Adam. So that takes place in the 19th century. Someone said that the Pope and the Virgin got together in the 19th century, and he made her immaculately conceived, and she made him infallible. It was both 19th century documents. In the 20th century, 1950, at the dawn of the space age, Mary was declared to be bodily assumed into heaven. That is, she didn't die. You wonder what we've done to women over the centuries? Carl Jung said that when they proclaimed the bodily assumption of the Virgin into heaven, that it was one of the great moments in religious history of human beings. The reason being, he said, that for the first time, the feminine was lifted into the divine. Well, that's true. But before we could lift the feminine into the divine, we had to desex it. Virgin birth, permanent virgin, postpartum virgin. And then we had to dehumanize it. She couldn't have a normal birth. She couldn't have a normal death. So what we did, we men, was to lift a peculiar definition of woman, desexed and dehumanized, and only then was it fit to be thought of as part of God. It says a lot about what human beings think about the sexuality of a woman. The story is always a developing story. But in the mind of my friend Geraldine Doogie, no one should be able to know these things because they would be disturbing. It might upset them. I should therefore be governed in my writing not by the pursuit of truth, but by my concern for the feelings of those who might read this book. This morning, what I want to do is to go into the Gospel of John far more deeply than we have before, in order to show that John had no intention when he wrote that book of having it be read literally. He had no intention. And if you know how to read this gospel, he tells you this time after time after time after time. There's no way that you can say that John wrote his gospel because he thought he was describing literal history. There's no way you can say that he wrote this gospel to give us biographical details about the life of Jesus, or that he wrote this gospel to communicate tape recordings of things Jesus had actually said, or photographs of things that he had actually done. And on every page of John's gospel, he tells you this if you know how to read it, if you know how to read his own signals. What John does is to employ two well-known Jewish techniques that all of his readers would have understood. The first technique is that he ridicules people who are literal-minded. He does it over and over and over again in his gospel. And the second technique is he employs a particular well-known Middle Eastern technique to storytelling. If you want to describe something to another person and you want to tell them in advance that this is a story and not a literal event of history, then you employ wild exaggeration. Let me now move into those two ways that John gives us a signal and look at his book. Ridicule. John ridicules literal-minded people. Chapter 3, Jesus is portrayed as having a conversation with a man named Nicodemus. He is a leading citizen, says John. He's an authority in the Jewish world. It's interesting that nobody's ever heard of him before John writes. But he is also the quintessential fundamentalist. He cannot think outside of the boundaries of his literal mind. And finally, Jesus recognizes that the conversation's not going anywhere because they're like two ships passing. Nicodemus simply cannot understand what he's saying. It doesn't fit into his literal categories. And so Jesus says to him, Nicodemus, you've got to open your mind. You've got to be born to a new perspective. You've got to be born again. That had nothing to do with having an emotional conversion experience. It was to be awakened to a dimension of reality beyond the capacity of that literal mind to understand. Nicodemus, you will never see what I'm talking about. You'll never hear. You'll never understand until you get outside the boundaries of literalism. And how does Nicodemus respond? Well, he's the quintessential fundamentalist. He takes Jesus' words literally. He says, born again? That's ridiculous. I'm a grown man. How am I going to climb back up into my mother's womb and be born again? That's a fundamentalist. He could not get outside the boundaries of his mind. He could not process the Jesus experience inside those limits. So John subjects this man to ridicule. Now, if that was the only instant in John's gospel where he did this, you might say, well, maybe we've misread it, but he does this over and over and over again. I won't mention them all, but let me just give you enough so that you see the pattern. Chapter 4, John's gospel. Jesus is having a conversation with a woman of Samaria. They are by a well. The conversation is about water. Jesus initiates the conversation by asking her for a drink. It's 12 noon. It's hot. He's sweating. It's a simple request. But according to this narrative, she turns that simple request into a debate about ethnicity. Instead of saying, of course I'll give you a drink, or no, I'm not going to give you a drink, she says, how is it that you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan, for water? And in case you don't understand that, John adds a little note that says, for Samaritans and Jews had no dealings with each other. And finally, after many stages of that conversation, Jesus says to this woman, if you knew who it was who was asking you for a drink of water, you would be asking me, and I would give you living water. I'd give you the kind of water that would satisfy your thirst so that you never thirsted again. And this Samaritan woman is a literalist. She's a fundamentalist. She can't get outside the confines of her square mind. And so she looks at him. You're going to give me water? Man, where are you going to get that water? You don't even have a bucket, she says. That's literalism. That's fundamentalism. And John ridicules it. He constantly makes fun of it. One will never understand this gospel if you try to read it literally. Next, the disciples become the fundamentalist. The disciples come having brought food. Jesus has been without food for a while, they think, so they bring some food. And they begin to urge him to eat. And Jesus turns to these disciples and he says, quote, I have food to eat of which you do not know. And the disciples look at each other and say, I wonder who brought him that food. That's literalism. They're trapped inside their literal minds. They cannot think outside the box. John warns his readers over and over and over again that this book cannot be understood if you think he's writing history or biography, or if you think you should take his words literally. In case the readers of John's Gospel miss this point, which he employs again and again and again, trying to warn his readers that you don't read this book literally, John also uses the second well-known technique of the Middle Eastern world to indicate that this is a story. And that is, he uses wild exaggeration. Exaggeration was the Middle Eastern way of saying you must listen to this outside literal boundaries. You and I in the Western world have a different way of accomplishing this purpose. If we start our stories by saying, once upon a time, we send a signal that this is a story. And if we end it by saying, and they lived happily ever after, you know you're listening to a story. So you don't get all upset when the big bad wolf eats grandma. Now, if it's a literal story, you get very upset. But this is not a literal story because it began once upon a time and it ended, they lived happily ever after. In the Middle Eastern world, they didn't have that technique, so they used exaggeration. And they would exaggerate something to the place where nobody could take it literally and make sense out of it. Now let's look how John uses, well, let's look first at how the Bible itself uses exaggeration. Think of the people that have struggled trying to read the Bible literally, trying to make sense out of stuff that makes no literal sense at all. Let's start with the book of Genesis, and I promise you I won't go all the way to the book of Revelation. Start with the book of Genesis. In the early chapters of the book of Genesis, the people decide they want to build a tower that is so tall it will reach into the sky and they could communicate one-to-one with God who lives above the sky. Now, do you think anybody really believed they could build a tower that tall? These people had never flown in an airplane. They had no sense about the distance of space except they were overwhelmed by it. The reason mountaintops are the place where you have religious experiences is that's as close to the sky as human beings could get. That's why God comes down on Mount Sinai to give the law. God didn't have to travel very far. The mountaintop was as close to heaven as you could get. That's just the literal mindset. So here you have a story where people are going to build a tower that is so tall that it'll reach beyond the sky. They didn't have cranes. So everybody knows that's a story. That's a once upon a time story. That's not to be taken literally. I think another one in the Old Testament is having the waters of the Red Sea part so the children of Israel can walk through on dry land. Now, there are a lot of complications with that story. One is that if Moses and the children of Israel actually went across the Red Sea, they ran about 500 miles out of their way. Another interesting point is that the words in the Hebrew Scripture don't say the Red Sea at all. They say the Yom Surf, which literally means a sea of reeds. It was probably some marshy land between Egypt and what is now Israel that had to be navigated. And maybe what the origin of the Red Sea story is that the children of Israel, a bunch of freeing slaves, are traveling light because when you're trying to get away from slavery, you only take the clothes on your back. And they looked ahead of them and they saw this swampy, marshy land. They looked behind them and they saw the tank divisions of the Egyptian army, the iron chariots barreling down upon them. That's what you call being caught between a rock and a hard place. And they decided they'd rather trust their fate to God, by which they meant we'll go into the swampy area, because they knew what the results were if they turned back and accepted the Egyptians. And so they began to walk into this swampy area, and they can navigate it. It's much slower, but they can navigate it. And so they're into the swamp sufficiently far away before the heavily armored soldiers and iron chariots of the Egyptians come, and when they try to come into this swampy land, they simply bog down. And so the Israelites got further and further and further away, and by the time that story is told, the Red Sea has been parted, and the children of Israel had walked through on dry land. It's an incredibly exaggerated story. We know how long or how deep or how wide the Red Sea is. We can measure that. We know from the Bible how long it took the children of Israel to navigate that body of water. And folks, if you put those together, these Israelites, pregnant women, babes in arms, elderly people on canes and walkers, they averaged 12-minute miles getting through the Red Sea. Now, I run every morning of my life, and a 15-minute mile is about all I can do. Can you imagine a horde of slave people in all stages of life and health navigating that body of water in 12-minute miles? That's not literal. That's an exaggerated story. I think the greatest illustration of an exaggerated story in the Hebrew Scriptures is the story of Jonah, where God creates a great fish so big that this fish can swallow Jonah in one bite, and that Jonah can set up housekeeping and live there for 3 days and 3 nights, rearranging the curtains and the furniture and having a wonderful time. And then even the great fish gets sick of Jonah. I think he probably smoked. And so the fish lets out a medieval belch and spits up Jonah. And he comes toppling out of the fish into the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, but it just happens to land on a sandbar. Folks, if you're writing that story, you can locate a sandbar anywhere you want to. That's an author's prerogative. This story is a story of great exaggeration. Whoever wrote the book of Jonah was trying to tell the people that this is not to be literal. The message of Jonah is that the love of God is always greater than the boundaries on your love. And so you have to go beyond your boundaries to Ninevites, to Gentiles, to unclean people, if you're going to understand anything about the love of God. That's a story of exaggeration. And everybody understood that until the Gentiles began to read the Bible with absolutely no Middle Eastern and Jewish background. John uses exaggeration over and over and over again in his gospel because he understood that it was not literal, and his audience would have understood his exaggeration. So let me just illustrate that briefly. In chapter 2, the story of Jesus turning water into wine at the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. If you read that story carefully, you'll discover that Jesus didn't just turn water into wine. He turned it into 900 bottles of wine. He turned it into 80 gallons of wine. Man, that was some wedding party. That was exaggeration, and everybody would have known that was exaggeration. And remember, it's not just cheap wine. It's not Gallows Special with a screw-top gallon jug. It's the finest of the Robert Mondavis, the finest of the Côte d'Arones. This is an exaggerated story. That's chapter 2. In chapter 6, Jesus is said to have fed a multitude made up of 5,000 men, plus some women and children. They eat too. And he did it with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And not only did he feed that mighty host, but when they had all eaten their fill, they gathered up the food fragments. They had boxes to take home from the restaurant, and they gathered up 12 baskets of fragments. That's not a literal story. That's an exaggerated story. It's a story in which the author is trying to say the love of God is sufficient to satisfy the deepest hunger in the hearts of men and women with a great abundant amount left over. In chapter 9, Jesus doesn't just restore sight to a blind man. He restores sight to a man who was born blind, who's never been able to see. And even the text says nothing like this has ever happened in the history of the universe. That's an exaggerated story. It's a story with a message. Read chapter 9. See who the real blind people are. See who it is that really sees in that narrative. And finally, in chapter 11, and we touched on this last evening, Jesus does not just raise a person from the dead. He raises from the dead somebody who's been dead for 4 days, who's been buried for 4 days, who's still in his binding wedding cloths, funeral cloths. And his flesh has already begun to decay. This is a well-dead person. And he calls him to come forth. And the specter comes walking out of the tomb with his flesh still putting off its odor of decay. This is an exaggeration story. John fills his gospel with these, telling us every moment that there's a different way to read what he is writing than to think it's literal. The author of this gospel is telling us in every way that he knows how that this gospel is not a literal story. It is an interpreted story. It is an attempt to discover the meaning in Jesus, not to describe any literal facts about Jesus. And so he ridicules literalism time after time after time. He employs exaggeration over and over and over again. This gospel is filled with the Jewish version of once upon a time, and they lived happily ever after. So if you and I are going to read this story, this gospel, we cannot read it literally, not if we want to be true to the author. And his original audience, which was all Jewish, would have understood the symbols that he was using. It's only when the Christian church becomes Gentile, around 150 of this common era, that nobody is left who understands the techniques that the Jewish writer is employing. And so biblical fundamentalism is a Gentile heresy, born out of Gentile ignorance. John will force us over and over again to look at his words in a very different manner. The story of this gospel is a profound story. It's a story about how the human and the divine can come together. How life can be expanded from conscious life to self-conscious life to universal conscious life. It's not a story about a God who came out of the sky and incarnated himself into a human form so that he was God in disguise walking around the earth. It's a story about a human being who was so deeply and fully human that all that God is and all that God means was experienced as present in him. And that's a very different way to read the fourth gospel. In my next presentation this afternoon, what I will do is to put the Johannine characters that we've already begun discussing under the spotlight and try to show why almost all of these characters are literary characters and not historical characters. They're much more like Harry Potter than they are George Washington. Much more like Sherlock Holmes than they are Abraham Lincoln. Much more about Wonder Woman than they are about Mother Teresa. They're the ways in which John interprets the life of Jesus by creating characters who will reveal the dimensions that he is trying to communicate. And once again, if you begin to understand these characters, there's no way you can read the fourth gospel literally and have it make sense. And then on Sunday, and that one troubles me because the time is so limited, what I want to do is to take John's view of the cross and try to show you why it was a triumph and not a tragedy. Why in John's mind it was not an instrument of execution, but a throne from which Jesus reveals all that it means to be God and all that it means to be human. And so at the end of this weekend, I hope you have the eyes to enter this one of our four Gospels in a very different way and to be able to go to its depths and feel its call to you, which is a call to live and a call to love and a call to have the courage to be everything that you're capable of being. The Gospel of John is a fantastic book. I'm sorry it took me so long in my life to discover its power. Well, let me stop there and see if there's any reaction. And we'll have questions, and I will will take off my coat so that I can reveal that I'm wearing the clerical collar of this church. Yay! The trouble with Roger is he wears a size 19. So I've got a lot of space here. I do have on a necktie, which is certainly not a Western tradition, but I'm an Easterner. I had a brother who left Duke University to take a position at the Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church in Austin, Texas. He gave me his overcoat and all of his neckties and never wore either again. I have not yet escaped the East. Questions will follow the same format. Every other question must come from a woman. I'd like for a woman to be first, because I think we ought to give women a priority. I'd like to ask you to try to make your questions questions. An awful lot of questions are more speeches than questions, and we can take a lot more if they're briefer. I'll try to exercise the discipline of being brief. I'd also like to make a personal request, if you're willing to do it. If you have a question that you ask, or even if you do not ask, and would like to give it to me or to my wife or to Roger or to anybody that looks familiar, they'll get it to me. In my column that I write every week, I use questions that come from real people. And my publisher company in Portland, is that right, Portland? They keep moving. They're now in Seattle. Okay, they're now in Seattle. They want you to sign your name and tell me where you're from. And that's their test to sort of make sure you're authentic and I didn't dream you up in my study so that I could only answer the questions that I wanted to answer instead of the real questions that come from real people. So if you're willing to have your questions considered for publication in this column, I wish you'd write them out and give me your name and hometown, that's all. If you don't want your full name to be used, you can give me your first name and an initial. About 100,000 people read this column every week all around the world. And I remember it comes out at 2 a.m. on Thursday morning, Eastern time, so that all my readers set their alarms for 2 a.m. Get up to get the hot news off the... But they came out one morning at 2 a.m. on Thursday, and by Friday morning at 10 o'clock, I had a response from Phnom Penh, Cambodia, which just makes me realize I live in a world that's so different from the one I grew up in. If you're interested in the column, it's a place somewhere you can sign up to receive it, but that's not my agenda. My agenda is to get questions from real people that I can continue to use. I have about 5,000 of them at this moment, so I can't guarantee that your question will be used, but I guarantee you it will be looked at and it will be considered. So with that agenda, we'll go to the First Lady.
My question is, if John is controversial and is different, really, how did he make it into the canon, and why was John selected? Because there were other choices.
It wasn't easy. He offered a counterpoint, and I'll talk about that a little this afternoon. He offered a counterpoint to the traditional view of Christianity, which was basically rooted in Paul. I think had he not claimed that it was written by one of the 12, it might not have gotten in. That was the way you got your thing considered. You'd write a letter and then you say, well, they're not going to listen to this if my name's Jack Spong, but if my name is John, the beloved disciple, then they might read it. And so there was a real battle as to whether or not it would be included. By 150, it was included. Dan Brown is a good storyteller, but he's not a very great biblical scholar. And when Dan Brown wrote the Da Vinci Code and sort of said that the canon of the New Testament was finally set at the Council of Nicaea, that's simply not accurate. It was pretty well set by 150, but it was not finally set until the latter years of the 4th century. And John was an outsider at the beginning. By the time he got to the Council of Nicaea, John was the harbinger of orthodoxy. That is, he was the one they quoted most to beat back the adoptionists and the Judaizers and anybody else that wanted to challenge their concept of both incarnation and Holy Trinity. So he became sort of the standard by which Orthodox Christianity was determined. In the battle in the Council of Nicaea between Athanasius and Arius, It was a battle between John, which is the only thing that Athanasius quoted, and Arius, who quoted Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But by that time, John was solidly in. There's still debate about some books in the New Testament. Now, Luther, for example, in the 16th century wanted to get James out. The book of Revelation had a hard time getting in. There were some other books like The Shepherd of Hermes, which is a Revelation-type book, that didn't quite make it. I think, was it Roger? Did you refer this morning to the Epistle of Clement that almost made it? Somebody that I've
yesterday I did.
Yeah, yesterday. Somebody, the Epistle of Clement, he was a bishop of Rome about 96, and he wrote a letter that was considered as scripture for a while, but finally didn't make the count. And then all the apocryphal gospels come along in the 2nd, 3rd century, the gospel of Mary Magdalene, the gospel of the Hebrews, the gospel of Peter, the proto-gospel of James. Many of these you can still read, and you can understand, I think, why the church decided they didn't fit into the canon. But John made it, and I think John gives the Pauline perspective a very interesting balance. And so I'm really glad it's there. It took me years to come to that, but I'm glad it's there. Thank you for your question. A gentleman. Here we go. Wait a second. You need to be heard. Wait a second. There you go.
Could you comment on the inclusion of the Book of Thomas by the Jesus Seminar people?
Yeah, I'm one of them. I don't agree with them. But if you're in the seminar, you know nobody ever agrees with anybody else, and we reach all our conclusions by majority vote, and then it becomes the word of the Lord. Thomas was discovered in Nagamati, a little village in Egypt, I think about 1946, but I'm not sure about that date. It could be 47, but I might 48, but I think it's 46. In a catch of literature, almost all of which was Gnostic in its tone. Now, we'd known that there was a Gospel of Thomas because there are some references back in earlier history where people referred to it, but we had no copies of it. So they discovered this at Nagamati, and it was a great discovery. It's a very brief book, less than one chapter, I think 114 verses. And it purports to be a collection of the sayings of Jesus, some of which are quite similar to the sayings of Jesus you find in the Synoptic Gospels, but with some additions. It has a much more sort of Eastern flavor about it. And once it was discovered, then the process of dating it took place. The fact that it was found in a group of Gnostic writings would tend to date it in the early years of the 2nd century. But the Jesus Seminar is motivated more than anything else. The Jesus Seminar is 250 scripture scholars who meet regularly to decide very important questions about whether Jesus actually said everything in the New Testament. And it's been going on for a long time, and I really love being a part of it. And they've taught me an awful lot of things, but there's always a great debate about everything. Then they vote with beads: red beads, pink beads, gray beads, and black beads. And if you vote a red bead, you think this is authentic Jesus material. If you vote a pink bead, it means it's close to Jesus, but has been corrupted by the church. If you vote a gray bead, the probability is that Jesus never said this. And if you vote a black bead, it means there ain't no way that Jesus ever said this. An illustration in that last category, Jesus could hardly have said, "Unless you take up your cross and follow me," because the cross had absolutely no meaning that was redemptive until after he died on it. So the historical Jesus could never have said, "You've got to take up your cross and follow me." And the interesting thing about St. John's Gospel is that only one line in all of John's Gospel got colored pink. None were red, one was pink, everything else was gray and black. And I think that's probably pretty accurate. And the one line that was pink, because Jesus makes a reference to the prophet is not without honor except in his hometown, and they thought that was an earlier and perhaps an echo of a more authentic voice of Jesus. But their desire, their agenda is to get as far back in history to the Jesus of history as they can possibly go, and they have built their entire point of view, and Charles could probably speak to this better than I can. They built their entire point of view on getting as early as possible. So some of them and I think Bob Funk was one of them, began to try to find justification for dating the Gospel of Thomas as early as 55, which would put it ahead of Mark, and it would put it into the period of the epistles of Paul. Now, I don't think he makes that case, but Bob Funk's a lot smarter than I am, so I'm not going to take him on publicly. But I don't think he makes that case. I don't see much evidence that the Gospel of Thomas is much earlier than the first quarter of the 2nd century. But that's a debate that'll probably go on, and it's not one I care a great deal about. But anyway, they elevated it into the canon when they published what is really a monumental book. I look for it. I've lost it. I don't know where it is. But I was looking for it the other day when I was doing some work on Matthew, and I couldn't find it. So I'm really frustrated. I have to go to my library and get it out again. But they color-coded all the words of Jesus. And the conclusion was, and I think I'm right in these percentages, that only 14% of the words attributed to Jesus in the New Testament are authentic, which means 86% are not, which startled a lot of people. I even disagree with that. I don't believe you can make a case for any one of them being a literal quotation. I don't believe that after 40 to 70 years, and in a language that Jesus never spoke, you have any reason to think that any one of them is literal. I don't know how you do a literal translation. Let me tell you my favorite translation story, and then I'll stop. And I may have told you this before. I've been here twice. I may be using the same stories. If I am, just sort of raise your hand. But I was lecturing across Finland, and I don't speak a word of Finnish, and neither do many people. I think there might be 5 million people in the world that speak Finnish, and 4,990,000 of them live in Finland. So you don't run into Finnish very often. But I had a Finnish translator who is a native Finn. He lives there in Solvang, California. But he sort of looks like he comes out of the North Country. He's got red hair and a red beard, and his stomach starts about his chin and goes down like this. And he's really good. His name is Jarmo Tarki. He's really good. I have no idea what he said in the translation. It was line by line. He didn't have a manuscript. I said a line, and he translated it hot on the spot. But I know at one point I used the phrase gay and straight, and he translated that happy and a ruler. And the only reason I know that is somebody in the audience who knew English better than Jarmo stood up and said, "Jarmo, you didn't get that one right," and explained what gay and straight meant. I should have known better than to use a colloquial expression anyway, but I didn't. And so she explained it, and so I know that that's one mistake he made. But if she hadn't been there, that's the way it would have been translated. And I don't know what they would have heard. But anyway, that's the problem with translation. I don't think there is such a thing as a perfect translation. When the Septuagint was translated into Greek, that's the Hebrew scriptures, about 250 years before the birth of Jesus. It was called the Septuagint because it was done by 70 scholars. And according to the legend, they worked in 70 separate cells. And then they came out of their cells, and miracle of miracles, they had 70 identical translations, which proved that the Holy Spirit had been working or that the honor system was not working, one of the two. But I have no confidence that when you know the nuances of words in English, I have no confidence that when you translate them and you don't know every nuance of the language into which you're translating, you can make it an identical translation. So I'm maybe even more radical than the Jesus Seminar. But anyway, that's the best I can do. Anything else from our seminar scholar here? Where are you?
Charlie had to leave, but
Okay.
Charlie has a new translation of the Gospel of Thomas that was published just about a year ago, and he was actually one of the translators at Nag Hammadi, and
Yep.
is deeply invested in it. But part of his argument, if I may speak for him, is that Thomas is a saying source, and we've long presumed that the Gospel's earliest iteration was as saying sources. So that's the argument for driving it back earlier. The seminar's elevation of it to the fifth gospel is something that I think a lot of us question, and I wish Charlie was here to
Yeah, I wish you were,
defend
too.
it. He's just, he's only passionate about these things when he gets me alone. If he was here, he would be
Okay.
fairly passive.
See, I'm
about
not convinced of the Q hypothesis either, but that made me a renegade in the Jesus seminar, because Q is gospel for them. I think Q is Matthew making midrashic comments on Mark, and Luke had both of them in front of him when he wrote, but that's too long a debate to go into. A lady. I see a lady. We need a microphone.
I need the exercise. Oh, and Yarmo's lost a lot of weight.
What sources do you think John had available to him?
That's an interesting debate. In the world of New Testament scholarship, they debate whether John knew any of the first three Gospels or any one of them. Maybe he knew all three, maybe he knew none, maybe he knew one and not another. I think there is a particular affinity between Luke and John, and I'll show you one of those affinities later in this afternoon when I get to a Johannine story that I think he borrows from Luke. But there are a number of places that sort of connect Luke and John that aren't with the others, so the stronger case can be made for Luke. But I'm convinced that you could not write in 95 to 100 and not be aware of all of the Gospels that were circulating in the early church. What they did was to copy them as soon as the church, whatever Mark was written for, and the tradition is he was written for the Christian community in Rome, it was not long before every major city wanted a copy of Mark's Gospel, so they got around pretty quickly. We do know that Matthew and Luke both had Mark in front of them when they wrote. Matthew quotes about 90% of Mark, almost verbatim. Luke quotes about 50% of Mark, almost verbatim. And then they have places where Matthew and Luke look like they have a common source, but it's not from Mark. And that's where the Q hypothesis comes from. That's attributed to this unknown source named Q. Q is the German word for Quelle, which means source. And the majority opinion, certainly the majority opinion in the Jesus Seminar and probably in the United States, is that the Q hypothesis is a now lost document that both Matthew and Luke had available to him, and the only place we can recover it is by looking at the places where Matthew and Luke are together. The minority opinion, and one advocated very powerfully by an English New Testament scholar named Michael Goulder, is that Matthew copied Mark and then made a number of additions to Mark, and that Luke had both Matthew and Mark, and he put those Matthean additions into his, and so it looks like they have a common source, but it's just Matthew. And that'll be a debate that'll go on well beyond my time on this earth, and it's not one that's terribly important to me. I'm just really skeptical when you build a whole theory on the basis of a lost document that nobody has ever found, because we keep finding documents, and it's been 2014 years, and I just think that's a weak argument. But anyway, I'm a minority, and so if you want to be with the majority, you advocate the Q hypothesis.
I think that's a pretty rapidly diminishing majority now. But the other argument that you didn't mention, that the seminar recently produced a book of the first New Testament regarding Marcion as being the originator, and a proto version of Luke has the Q material, what we've called the Q material in it. And they would argue differently than what you've said, that Matthew copied proto Luke and that John was a corrective to Marcion.
See, that means you base your theory on more than one lost document. That's all I'm saying is that's a tough theory to prove when your whole proof is on a document you're postulating that existed. So I would take the simpler one but as I say, the kingdom of heaven is not going to depend on that. It's just fun and games for biblical scholars, and they love to play them. Any other comments, questions? Yes, I see two hands, but they're both male.
It's a boy's turn.
It's a boy's turn. Okay, you'll get your mic in a moment.
Bishop, when a person accepts your way of looking at Scripture, which I certainly do, how does that impact their desire and their activism in working to meet the needs of the poor, the deprived, the marginalized of the world?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know that they thought of those two things as connected. I think the case for being aware of the poor and the marginalized was best made by Roger in his comments this morning.
Yeah, Mel, did you miss my talk this morning, or did you just... Mel has purchased a copy of my book. We'll
Yes,
be sure that he reads that chapter.
I just thought it was tremendous this morning. To me, it's... let me see if I can say this and not repeat something I've got planned for later. When Matthew places words into the mouth of the risen Christ for the first time, the words are what we call the Great Commission, which I think the Gentile world totally misunderstood. We read the Great Commission, go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to be, go convert the heathen. I don't think that's what Matthew was talking about at all. I think he was saying, now that you understand something about the God revealed in the life of Jesus, you've got to go out to all those that you have diminished, those you have defined as less than human. You've got to go out to the people of color and to women and to other religious groups, and you've got to tell them the gospel, which is that the love of God includes you. So I think our concern for the poor is a recognition of our common humanity. And I don't believe that I can be human while I continue to participate in the dehumanizing of another human being. That's why getting over all of these prejudices with which I was raised became absolutely essential to my understanding of God, my understanding of Christ, and my understanding of my own humanity. And I think we've got to keep that in front of the church at every moment. The purpose of the Christian faith is not to save sinners. I'll develop that more on Sunday. The purpose of the Christian faith is to enhance humanity. And I cannot enhance my humanity while I'm denigrating somebody else's. It always dehumanizes me. I remember going to South Africa in the days of apartheid, and it seemed to me that everybody was rude. Even the customs officer seemed rude when we came into the country. And I kept wondering about that. But I think if you chuck off a great segment of humanity and decide that they are not human, that your humanity becomes so compromised in the process that you don't know how to relate to any other human being. And so I think the great emancipation of this country, and Martin Luther King Jr. stated this, that his task was not just to free the black man, and I'm sure he meant woman too, but he lived a little before we got inclusive language, but the task is to free your own humanity, because if I dehumanize another, inevitably I become less human myself. And so I think it's an interconnected thing and not necessarily a way of how you interpret the scriptures literally or non-literally. I think the message of the Christ is that everyone is called to live and to love and to be, and our task as Christians is to enhance people's ability to live fully and to love wastefully and to be all that they can be. And I don't know how you compromise that. I was talking to one of my doctors. When you reach my age, you have one for every organ. But a wonderful young man, Jewish man, as a matter of fact. He's been my doctor for something like 14 years. And I'm very fond of him. He's ultra right-wing politically. My status in his office went up enormously when he was watching the O'Reilly Factor one night, and I was Bill O'Reilly's guest. He thought if I was Bill O'Reilly's guest, I couldn't be all bad. But anyway, so we got to talking about this, and he's an incredibly sensitive, competent doctor. But he has no sense that everybody ought to have a right to health care. Just by being alive, they ought to have a right to health care. And his analogy was that if my toilet gets stopped up, I call a plumber. And the plumber comes and I pay to have the plumber fix my toilet. Well, you can get along without a toilet, not comfortably, but you can get along without a toilet for a good bit of time. You can't get along without health care. And these are not in the same category. And so I think once you begin to understand that to be human, certainly in the richest nation in the world, that everybody ought to have the right to sufficient food, sufficient shelter, sufficient health care. And does that make you a liberal? Does that make you a communist? I think if you understand the Christian gospel, that makes you a compassionate child of God and nothing else. But anyway, I just disagree with my doctor and with Senator Cruz on those issues and probably some more. But thank you for your question. A lady? And what's our time, Roger? Is this the last one?
Probably should be.
Okay. Let's finish with a lady then. Or you had a question up that we never got to. Let's violate our rules and take the final question. Thank you for being patient.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. I was curious with the theme of your talk about the Middle Eastern perspective of the narrative being an exaggeration and metaphor and so forth. I was curious, would there be other literature around that time that would be examples of Middle Easterns using the exaggeration and metaphor?
I'm sure there would be. My illustrations have all come out of the Hebrew Scriptures. But you see, what people don't understand is the Middle East is not just a tinderbox in our world today, it's a tinderbox since the dawn of civilization. Because Israel, Palestine, the disputed areas were literally between the first civilization in Egypt in the Nile River Valley and the equally first, I don't remember which one was actually first, civilization in the Tigris-Euphrates. And they fought back and forth across that land forever. So there's no such thing as an individual nation. The Palestinians and the Jews are cousins, folks. Their DNA is deeply connected, and even the Bible says that the Palestinians, or the Arabs, are the descendants of Abraham through Ishmael. Ishmael was the half-brother of Isaac, and through Isaac the Jews descended, through Ishmael the Arabs descended. And if you read the Bible carefully, you'll find that every people came out of somebody in the biblical story. The daughters of Lot. Remember when Lot's wife turned to a pillar of salt, and they went off and they lived in a cave, and the daughters of Lot got their father inebriated and seduced him and got pregnant by their father in a bold act of incest because they feared that in that cave they could never find husbands, and their father was their only option. And they had 2 children, one each. One was named Ammon, from whom the Ammonites arose, and the other was named Moab, from whom the Moabites emerged. So Lot was the nephew of Abraham, so they're all kin. Well, that's literally accurate. They are all kindred people. So if you can find a type of literature among the Jews, the high probability, and I simply haven't gone into it, but the high probability is you can find it in all of them. And go back and read the myths and stories of the Sumerians and the Babylonians. And we don't even know where their boundaries are. Both Baghdad and Nineveh are today in Iraq. But at one point, Babylon and Nineveh were enemies, and Baghdad is a later name, I think, for Babylon, the city of Babylon, but they're both in the same country today. But you go through these symbols, and it's just sort of overwhelming how interrelated all of them are. So I probably ought to go research that, but I haven't. But I think the Bible gives you enough illustrations. Well, thank you all for a happy morning. I've enjoyed being with you, and I'll see you this afternoon.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.